On a cold March morning in 1943, in a quiet wood-paneled office hidden deep inside the labyrinth of Berlin's military bureaucracy, a single envelope lay on a polished desk, waiting for the man who would soon learn just how dangerous its contents truly were. Outside, the city moved with the numb rhythm of a nation at war, but inside that dim room the air felt still, as if holding its breath. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris walked in without ceremony, set down his cap, and noticed the envelope immediately. It was thin, almost weightless, not the kind of document anyone expected to change the course of a global conflict. Yet, something about it drew his attention. Perhaps it was the courier's uncharacteristic silence, or perhaps it was the simple instinct of a man who had spent a lifetime sifting truth from noise. He opened it, unfolded a single sheet of paper, and began to read. At first, he thought he had misunderstood the figures. They looked exaggerated, absurd even. But the more his eyes moved across the lines, the harder his pulse began to beat. By the time he reached the end, he wasn't confused anymore. He was certain. The numbers were not a mistake. The implications were enormous, and the quiet room around him suddenly felt far too small. The report did not describe a new Allied weapon. It did not warn of a surprise invasion. Instead, it outlined something far more dangerous to a nation already stretched thin. It described an American factory, still ramping up production, but projected to achieve a level of output that defied the logic of every German industrial expert. According to multiple sources, this plant would soon build a 4-engine heavy bomber every 60 minutes, not every week or every day, but every hour. Canaris lowered the page and stared at nothing. He understood what such a rate meant. He didn't need charts or equations. He knew that modern war was an unforgiving contest of industrial endurance, and if this projection was real, Germany had already crossed the threshold beyond which victory became an illusion. To the average officer in Berlin, the idea would have sounded comical, a piece of arrogant American propaganda. But Canaris knew the spies who delivered this intelligence. They were not men prone to exaggeration. They were meticulous, discreet, and painfully aware that errors in their work were often paid for in blood. Their reports came from diplomats, engineers, businessmen, and observers who operated in silence across neutral capitals. One by one, they had contributed fragments of a picture that now lay fully assembled before him. Canaris leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. He had spent years watching the war transform from a bold gamble into a relentless grind. In the early victories, his intelligence service had been celebrated, its agents praised for helping secure lightning-fast triumphs. But now, after the disaster at Stalingrad, the reality was shifting. Germany was no longer dictating the pace of the conflict. It was reacting to it, scrambling to patch holes in a strategy stretched beyond its limits. And as the tide turned, Canaris found that fewer and fewer people were willing to listen to unfiltered truth. He looked again at the document. The numbers were not just impressive, they were devastating. A single American factory producing heavy bombers at this rate would overwhelm the combined efforts of the entire German aviation sector. It would turn the sky into a battlefield Germany could not hope to control. It would mean that every plane shot down over Europe could be replaced multiple times before German factories completed even one. The intelligence had not arrived all at once. It trickled in through coded messages, whispered reports, and subtle observations. A Swedish engineer claimed to have seen an assembly line moving with uncanny fluidity. A diplomat overheard American military planners speaking casually about aircraft production goals that sounded impossible to European ears. A visiting industrialist described a plant so vast its workers joked it had its own weather. At first, analysts discounted these stories. They sounded exaggerated or misunderstood. But piece by piece the pattern formed, and by the time it reached Canaris's desk, the conclusion was undeniable. Willow Run, the Ford Motor Company's massive bomber plant in Michigan, was evolving into something Europe had never seen before, an industrial organism capable of turning raw materials into flying fortresses with mechanical precision. German engineers would have laughed at the idea. They believed aircraft required craftsmanship, not mass production. A bomber, especially one as complex as the B-24 Liberator, demanded expert hands and meticulous assembly. It was a machine of more than 1 million parts, as intricate as it was powerful. To produce one in 60 minutes sounded not just impossible, but insulting to their understanding of engineering. Yet the Americans, unrestricted by tradition, had chosen to treat the bomber the way they treated automobiles. They broke it down into thousands of small tasks. They designed tools and jigs to eliminate human error. They taught unskilled workers to repeat motions until the aircraft grew around them in a steady, unstoppable flow. Canaris reread the numbers. 24 bombers a day, more than 700 a month, from a single plant. For a moment he imagined the skies over Germany darkened by swarms of these machines, wave after wave, replenished faster than they could be destroyed. He imagined oil refineries burning, railways torn apart, factories flattened before they could produce a single replacement. He could already see the future drawn in the simple arithmetic of production capacity. He knew he had to bring this to Hitler. It didn't matter how unwelcome the news might be. Facts did not bend to ideology, but he also knew how insulated the Führer had become. Hitler lived inside a fortress of loyalists who filtered what he heard, protecting him from anything that contradicted his worldview. Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, was the loudest guardian of that illusion. He dismissed all reports of American industrial strength with disdain, insisting that a nation built on consumerism could never outperform Germany in a contest of military production. To Göring, Americans made refrigerators, not bombers. Canaris folded the report carefully and stood. He knew what he carried was more than intelligence. It was a mirror reflecting a truth the regime did not want to see. As he walked down the hallway, he felt the weight of the future in his hands, a future no longer shaped by ideology, but by the relentless machinery of American industry. The walls of the building seemed to lean inward as if the structure itself sensed the storm on the horizon. And as he prepared to deliver the most important warning of his career, he already feared the answer he would receive. Canaris did not expect an easy reception, but even he was unprepared for the wall of denial he encountered as he climbed deeper into the hierarchy of the regime. The first obstacle was Göring, whose pride had grown so inflated that it floated above reason itself. When Canaris presented the figures, Göring barely glanced at them before a smirk curled across his face. He dismissed the intelligence as if it were a child's fantasy, waving his hand theatrically while boasting about the superiority of German engineering. He insisted that American production methods were crude and undisciplined, that their workers lacked the precision and dedication required to build complex machines, that mass production was appropriate for toasters and automobiles, but laughable when applied to strategic aircraft. To him, the very suggestion that America could outproduce Germany in something as sophisticated as heavy bombers was not just wrong. It was absurd. Canaris tried to explain the methodology, the sources, the confirmation from multiple intelligence channels, even the corroborating reports from Japan's military attachés. but ideology had already smothered logic. Göring leaned back, inflated with confidence, as if the act of rejecting a fact made it untrue. To admit the intelligence was valid would mean admitting that his Luftwaffe, once hailed as unstoppable, was now being eclipsed by an industrial opponent he had vowed to dominate. It would mean acknowledging that his own promises of victory in the air were collapsing under the weight of cold mathematics, and so he laughed instead. The problem was that Göring's delusions held power. In Hitler's inner circle, confidence mattered more than competence, and Göring projected absolute certainty. Canaris knew that bypassing him would be risky, but the stakes were too high to retreat. He continued upward until he secured an opportunity to present the report to Hitler himself. As he waited outside the briefing room, the corridors seemed unnaturally quiet, like the halls of a fortress cut off from the world beyond. Officers passed in silence, their faces tense, avoiding eye contact. Here, reality was not something to be confronted, but something to be managed, trimmed, softened, or hidden altogether. When the doors finally opened, Canaris stepped inside and immediately felt the suffocating atmosphere that surrounded Hitler during wartime. Maps covered the walls, some marked with optimistic arrows that bore little resemblance to the front lines. Staff officers stood with rigid posture, ready to reinforce whatever narrative Hitler needed to hear. Canaris approached with the calmness of a man who knew he might not be believed, yet also knew that truth did not require belief to remain true. Hitler took the report, scanned the first lines, and slowly narrowed his eyes. His face grew tighter as he read, not with curiosity but with irritation. He skimmed the projected output, the factory layout, the engineering innovations, the labor figures, and the summaries of American capability. Then his expression hardened into something almost feral. He placed the paper down with deliberate slowness, as if handling something repulsive. He said the intelligence was nonsense. He said the Americans lacked discipline, unity, and racial strength. He said their industrial numbers were inflated by Jewish manufacturers and Wall Street parasites. He said no nation of mixed heritage and democratic chaos could ever surpass Germany in the tools of war. His voice rose as he spoke, each sentence laced with anger, not because the data was flawed, but because it contradicted the mythology on which he had built his worldview. In that moment, Canaris realized that Hitler was not rejecting the numbers. He was rejecting the possibility that he might be wrong. Speer, who stood nearby, watched the exchange in silence. He understood machinery, logistics, and the unforgiving logic of shortages. He understood that the American production figures were not fantasy. But he also understood that if he agreed openly, he would be seen as challenging the ideological foundation of the Reich. So he remained quiet, offering no support to Canaris, leaving him alone on an island of unwelcome truth. Hitler ended the discussion by declaring that the intelligence was defeatist propaganda. He said Germany would triumph through willpower and racial superiority, not through factories and assembly lines. He dismissed Canaris with an impatient gesture and returned to his maps, choosing comforting illusions over uncomfortable facts. As Canaris left the room, he felt the weight of inevitability settling on his shoulders. He had delivered the message. He had fulfilled his duty. But the warning had fallen on ears determined not to hear. The truth, instead of illuminating strategy, had been treated as treason. Outside, the air felt colder, the corridors darker. The structure of the Reich, built on arrogance and myths, seemed suddenly fragile, like glass waiting for a single crack to spread. And beyond the borders of Germany, that crack was already forming. In a faraway corner of Michigan, the factory Hitler refused to acknowledge was awakening into full force, its assembly lines moving with a tempo no field marshal could outmaneuver. Willow Run was becoming the beating heart of an industrial juggernaut, and every hour that passed pushed Germany closer to a breaking point it could no longer avoid. The sky would soon fill with proof of the truth Hitler had denied, and Germany would pay for that denial not in theory or projections, but in fire, steel, and ash. Within months, the consequences of ignoring the warning began to reveal themselves in the most unmistakable language a war can speak. At first, the presence of more American bombers was noticeable but not yet alarming. Intelligence officers reported increased sightings over the North Sea. Radar operators observed larger formations moving with growing confidence. Pilots returning from defensive sorties spoke of unfamiliar tail markings and an unusual consistency in enemy aircraft models. These details accumulated gradually, like ripples forming ahead of a distant storm. But as 1943 gave way to 1944, the ripples became waves, and the waves became something far larger. The United States had begun to unleash the industrial power Germany had dismissed as fantasy. Every hour, Willow Run pushed another bomber toward the skies, a steady heartbeat of metal and manpower. Each aircraft emerged fully formed, engines polished, fuselage gleaming, guns mounted, ready to join the war. And from dozens of other American factories, fighters, transports, and replacement parts flowed with equal determination. This was not propaganda. This was a tidal force of production unlike anything the world had ever seen. German commanders quickly noticed the shift. Defensive engagements that once involved a few dozen enemy aircraft suddenly involved hundreds. The Luftwaffe scrambled fighters at an exhausting pace, forced to intercept formation after formation. Pilots, already strained from constant missions and dwindling supplies, found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to grow stronger every week. For every bomber they managed to bring down, more appeared the next day, as if the sky itself were manufacturing them. The truth was far simpler. America was replacing losses faster than Germany could register them. And then came the moment that confirmed everything the Willow Run report had predicted. Big Week. In February 1944, the United States launched a concentrated offensive designed to cripple Germany's aircraft industry. The scale of the operation was staggering. Wave after wave of bombers crossed into German airspace, escorted by fighters with increasingly long range, protecting them deep into territory once considered safe. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them, fueled by desperation and dwindling reserves, but it was not a battle of equal sides. It was a collision between a force growing stronger and a force breaking under the strain of its own limits. German pilots fought fiercely. Many were veterans who had survived the early years of the war, but experience could not compensate for mathematics. For every German fighter shot down, only a trickle of replacements came from factories struggling with shortages, bomb damage, and constant pressure. For every American bomber destroyed, the assembly lines at Willow Run rolled out replacements with mechanical certainty. Even when losses were high, morale did not waver, because the pilots knew they were supported by a nation capable of replenishing them without hesitation. By the end of Big Week, the Luftwaffe had suffered losses it could not recover from. Factories lay in ruins, fuel supplies were shrinking, training programs were crippled. The once proud Air Force that Göring had promised would dominate the skies was now fractured, exhausted, and gasping for resources that no longer existed. And above them, the bombers kept coming. All over Germany, The evidence of the industrial imbalance became impossible to ignore. Cities that once seemed untouchable endured days of relentless bombardment. Smoke rose from shattered industrial districts. Transportation networks collapsed under repeated strikes. One by one, the critical organs of the German war machine began to fail. And as each failure echoed through the Reich, the truth Canaris had tried to deliver continued unfolding across the map like a prophecy reaching its fulfillment. Yet despite the obvious signs, the leadership remained trapped inside the fortress of its own delusions. Göring, confronted with reports of massive aircraft formations, insisted that the numbers were exaggerated, that Allied losses were being hidden, that Germany would soon rebound with new wonder weapons. Hitler clung to the belief that willpower would overcome material disadvantage, that the German soldiers' superior spirit would triumph against an enemy he still refused to regard as formidable. Even as Germany burned, they held fast to the comfort of ideology rather than the clarity of fact. For Canaris, the consequences of this denial were not just strategic, they became personal. His insistence on truth, once valued, now appeared threatening in a regime increasingly intolerant of dissent. The Abwehr, once the eyes and ears of the German military, found itself under suspicion. The SS watched its officers with growing hostility, interpreting any sober analysis as defeatism. Canaris sensed the shift long before any accusation was spoken aloud. He knew the regime no longer wanted intelligence, it wanted validation. Still, he continued his work. He continued to gather information, to assess reports with precision, to warn those willing to listen. But the walls around him tightened, files disappeared, inquiries were launched. Rivals whispered that the Abwehr lacked zeal, that its officers were unreliable, that Canaris himself harbored doubts incompatible with the state's demands. In a regime built on fear, such whispers were more dangerous than any enemy agent. While Germany's skies filled with American bombers, Germany's corridors filled with suspicion. And just as the Reich pushed aside the truth Canaris delivered about Willow Run, it soon prepared to push aside Canaris himself. The storm he had predicted was now fully visible across the horizon, yet still the leadership looked away, clinging to fantasies even as the foundations beneath them crumbled. And as the Luftwaffe faltered, as the industrial heart of Germany was carved apart piece by piece, the consequences of ignoring that single sheet of paper continued to unfold with merciless precision. As the sky filled with growing waves of Allied aircraft, each one a testament to the industrial engine Germany had refused to acknowledge, the Luftwaffe's decline accelerated. Fighter groups that once patrolled the skies with confidence now struggled to launch enough planes to form a meaningful defense. Maintenance crews lacked parts, ground crews lacked fuel, training programs lacked time. Even the bravest pilots found themselves thrown into hopeless battles, outnumbered, outpaced, and overwhelmed. Some missions devolved into chaos before combat even began, engines failing on takeoff or aircraft stalling due to lack of proper repairs. The Luftwaffe was not losing because it lacked courage. It was losing because its enemy could build faster, repair faster, and replace faster than Germany could comprehend. The skies over the Reich became a daily reminder of the truth that had been buried months earlier. Each bomber formation that darkened the horizon carried within it the echo of the Willow Run report. Each raid demonstrated what mass production truly meant in modern war. For every factory the Allies destroyed, for every refinery they ignited, for every transport line they severed, Germany felt the walls of its war effort closing in with more force. And still, at the highest levels, denial persisted. Hitler spoke of iron will and last-minute miracles. Göring promised that wonder weapons would reverse the tide. Ideology replaced strategy. Faith replaced arithmetic. And the cost of that blindness deepened with every hour. Meanwhile, the Abwehr was collapsing under internal pressure. The SS, sensing opportunity, tightened its grip. They viewed the intelligence service as a nest of skeptics and moderates, a place where officers thought too much and believed too little in the mythology binding the regime together. Every discrepancy, every cautious assessment, every realistic projection became grounds for suspicion. Men who had once been respected analysts were suddenly treated as possible subversives. Files were reviewed with scrutiny. Conversations were monitored. The shadow of accusation spread like frost across the corridors of Berlin. Canaris watched this transformation with a fideda, calm born of acceptance rather than resignation. He understood that his insistence on truth had placed him on a collision course with the regime he served. He had always walked a careful line, balancing duty with conscience, navigating the contradictions of a government that demanded loyalty but punished honesty. As the war deteriorated, that line vanished. His loyalty to Germany, to its survival and its people, was now interpreted as disloyalty to Hitler. His clarity was mistaken for doubt, his warnings for defeatism, and in a system where perception mattered more than reality, perception was enough to condemn. As the months passed, the consequences of ignoring the Willow Run intelligence played out with an inevitability that felt almost mechanical. Allied bombers struck deeper into Germany with growing regularity. Industrial towns that had once pulsed with productivity fell silent under layers of ash and debris. The Luftwaffe's defenses fractured. The German war machine, starved of fuel and replacements, slowed to a crawl, and the once unyielding confidence of the Nazi leadership gave way to frantic improvisation, contradictory orders, and widening cracks in the structure of command. Through it all, Canaris remained at his post, still gathering intelligence, still analyzing reports, still sending assessments into a void where truth no longer had any weight. But his position grew precarious. The SS pursued control over all intelligence functions, and the Abwehr became their primary target. It was only a matter of time before they moved against him. When they finally did, they did so with precision. Canaris was arrested, interrogated, and isolated. His diaries, filled with observations and frustrations he had never voiced aloud, became evidence against him, twisted to support accusations that he had never intended to harm Germany, but had dared to oppose the delusions guiding it toward ruin. While he awaited judgment, the very future he had foreseen continued unfolding outside his cell. American production reached new heights. Bombers filled the sky with formations so vast that German observers could scarcely count them. Factories that Hitler believed untouchable were flattened in a matter of hours. Transportation arteries that fed the eastern and western fronts were severed. The strategic vision of the Reich imploded. What had been predicted by a handful of intelligence analysts became impossible to deny, even for those who had built their power upon denial itself. Canaris's fate was sealed not by treason, but by truth. The regime that had once relied on his clarity now viewed that clarity as a threat. And though his life ended in darkness, the consequences of the leadership's blindness played out exactly as he had anticipated. The Americans achieved the production rate that Germany had declared impossible. Willow Run delivered aircraft at a pace no European industry could match, and the imbalance that Hadler, Göring, and their inner circle had refused to acknowledge grew into a force that reshaped the war, one bomber at a time. In the end, The story did not hinge on after-the-fact statistics or grand retrospectives. It hinged on a moment in a quiet Berlin office where a single sheet of paper revealed a future that ideology refused to accept. The leadership of the Reich chose to ignore it, and the war unfolded accordingly. The truth was simple and merciless. Modern conflict was no longer determined solely by bravery or strategy. It was determined by output, by supply chains, by the relentless hum of factories that could replace what was lost faster than an enemy could destroy it. And in that arena, Germany never stood a chance against an industrial giant it had mocked into complacency. The prophecy contained in the Willow Run intelligence did not require belief to come true. It required only time. And as bombers churned out by the hour crossed the Atlantic and filled the sky, that prophecy became reality, sealing the fate of a regime that had mistaken dogma for destiny. The war Germany imagined it was fighting was not the war it was actually in. And the failure to recognize that distinction, quiet, simple, numerical, became one of the most decisive blows of the entire conflict.